Hi and welcome back to ScottiesTech.Info. I'm Scotty with my co-host Cletus, and we're just hanging out here in quarantine, self-confinement. Speaking of which, there's been a lot of talk lately of the possibility, rather people claiming, that this coronavirus COVID-19 is actually caused by 5G. So I wanted to make a quick video because we need to actually look at some actual data. And obviously, if the virus is not a virus and the symptoms of it are actually caused by 5G systems, then we should be able to find a simple correlation between deployment of 5G systems around the world and countries and regions that are especially hard hit by the coronavirus, right? So let's take a look. So first we look here at China, where the whole thing began, and you can see there's a big red blob by Wuhan, and there's another blob over there by Seoul, and so, okay, that gives you an idea of where the outbreaks were in China. Now on the next screen here, we see these are the actual 5G deployments in China. Now, there's a map, it's by Ookla, and I'll put a link to it down in the description, and these are actual, if you click on each of these dots, you can see that it shows it's a provider, the name of a provider and the name of a city. So for example, near Shanghai, where you see the number 17, that means that there are 17 companies in towns near Shanghai that have actually deployed 5G. It's commercially available, widely available for general use. On the Ookla map, you can actually select test installations. I left those off for the simple reason that very frequently when they're doing a 5G test, you don't have massive coverage. They put like an antenna here, they stick an antenna over there on the window, they do basic tests. Many times the actual frequency spectrum that they're going to be using for 5G hasn't even been auctioned off yet, so no one is even officially allowed to use it yet. So the testing phase is basically a very small amount of coverage, and so I left those off. Because the simple fact of the matter is that if 5G is causing COVID-19, well then in the areas where you actually have commercial deployment and many installations, those should be worse anyway. So, okay, so that's the map of China with the 5G coverage. So if we overlap those two, we get, well, it's kind of a correlation. But there are a few problems, because obviously the eastern half of China, that's where most of the COVID-19 cases were, and in the eastern half of China you have the most 5G, right? Except, well, not so fast, because you notice that nice red circle by Wuhan, there's the number 3 next to it. You don't really have that many 5G deployments active at the moment. And then if you look over near Seoul, you've got another little red blob, and there are 174 deployments in that area. So, yeah, there's kind of a loose correlation in China, but it's nothing to write home about. Okay, well, what about the USA? So here we have a map of the coronavirus infections recorded in the USA. And here we have a map of the 5G deployments, commercially available, blah, blah, blah. That's a lot of 5G in the US. So if we overlap those, what do we see? Well, again, yeah, it kind of loosely correlates, but again, not really. You can see over near New York and Washington, D.C., there's 336, 485, tons and tons of 5G, and of course there's a big red blob, which means, right, the virus hit New York very hard, and so on and so forth. But then you go a little bit further to the west, and you have, say, the Chicago area, and there's maybe like 10 deployments, Detroit, well, there's only 2 deployments. And of course you get into the western half of the country and you've got, 111, 37, 8, 17, 24. The western part of the country, you have a whole lot of 5G going on, apparently already commercially available, and yet you don't have very many virus circles. So again, you could say here there's maybe a very, very loose correlation, but not really. Okay, so what about Canada? Here's a map of Canada. You can see they have a few little red circles. And how about 5G in Canada? Okay, so there are no active commercialized systems based on 5G active in Canada at the moment, so that doesn't really bode well for our theory. How about South America? Again, you probably heard there were infections in Brazil, there's stuff going on in Argentina. So then we look at the actual 5G deployments in South America, and it looks like there's one kind of down there near Uruguay, but that's pretty much it. So again, that also doesn't bode well for our theory. And finally, we can take a look at France. So here's a nice map of France. As you know, France was one of the hardest hit European countries. Fortunately, I live in the southwest of France, where there's hardly anything. And so that's COVID-19 in France. And here we have the map of actual 5G deployments in France. Oops! There is no 5G in France. In fact, there are a few, just a small handful of test setups, but as a matter of fact, the COVID-19 crisis actually postponed the actual spectrum auction. They're going to auction off the spectrum something like 3 to 3.6 gigahertz. That was supposed to happen this past month, March of 2020, and it did not happen because of the lockdown. So there are no actual commercially active systems anywhere in France at the moment. So again, that does not really bode well for our theory that COVID-19 is caused by 5G. And this is kind of the point. If you have a theory about something and you can very easily find counterexamples or evidence that the theory doesn't work, then most likely the theory is probably not correct. In fact, it's rather dangerous to try and find one thing to blame everything on. There was a Polish psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Andrzej Łobaczewski. He was Polish. He wrote the book Political Pornorology, which is actually an excellent read. It's a bit dense. But in that book, he talked about something called a reversive blockade. And I'm going to read you a little description of what a reversive blockade is. It's a psychological phenomenon, and basically it works by when we emphatically insist upon something that is the opposite of the truth, it ends up blocking our minds from perceiving what's actually happening in reality. Then what we do is we try to find some sort of healthy middle ground, and in the end we basically end up believing something that's still not true. So, okay, well, what does that actually mean? Well, basically you have a virus outbreak, and of course it's scary, and people are freaked out, understandably, and we don't know what's going to happen. There's a whole lot of uncertainty, there's a whole lot of anxiety. This has never happened before. And so we could simply accept the fact that it's a virus. But instead, we know that from reading various studies and maybe watching some of my videos, you know that things like 2G, 3G, 4G, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and 5G, all these wireless technologies, there have been many, many, many studies done. There have been studies done by various doctors, various other health professionals. Physicists have published papers in prestigious journals talking about, this stuff is not good. And I've talked about a lot of that stuff in my previous videos. So because we have this virus, and this causes uncertainty, anxiety, whatever, and then because we have this knowledge that, okay, but we know that wireless is bad, and maybe we're kind of worked up because we want to get rid of the wireless stuff. So then we start blaming and we say, there is no COVID-19 virus, it's all just the 5G. But then we have a problem, because when you look at the counterexamples, suddenly you have to go, wait, hang on a minute, how do I justify this? How do I rationalize it? For example, the graph I showed about Canada. How is it that if there's no 5G in Canada, they have COVID-19 cases? And then, of course, you start rationalizing in your head and you say, well, yeah, okay, that's because it's caused by the 5G, but it was caused by 5G in the US, and it was people in the US, and they crossed the border north into Canada, and that's how those dots got there. Okay, that seems a little far-fetched, but maybe, right? But then how do you explain France? Because there are no 5G systems in France, and it was one of the hardest hit European countries. And so the problem here is that because you have this contradictory information, you start sort of, you try to use your common sense, but what you end up doing is basically coming to another conclusion that's maybe somewhere in the middle that is still false. And as I said, this is totally understandable, especially when we're confronted with contradictory information. First we're told that the coronavirus only strikes elderly people, then suddenly it's like, babies are dying from it, and it's this horrible situation, and like everyone is freaking out. And that contradictory information can kind of make you even more worried, and even more, you have more anxiety, more, it makes you crazy, basically. So the thing to do is to actually, it's perfectly fine to come up with theories. It's perfectly fine to ask why. It's a good thing to ask questions. It's not a good thing to just, well, the newspaper told me this, so I'll just go with that. Like, no, I never do that. You should always ask questions, but if you come up with a hypothetical scenario, it should be a hypothetical scenario that cannot be easily disproven by a few simple maps you find on the internet. It has to be a theory that fits all the available facts. For example, I could give you a hypothetical scenario. It is a virus. Maybe it didn't just mutate. Maybe some of the rumors about it being bioengineered, it was engineered in some secret military government lab, by this country or that country, who knows by what country. And it somehow got out, and people started freaking out. And then maybe even it mutated, and other things happened, and, it's still a virus. It will still spread like a virus, but there's still, we don't maybe have all the details about what's going on, and maybe we won't for some time yet. But there's a hypothetical scenario for you that would still kind of fit the facts as we know them. And of course, we don't really even know lots of facts because we're getting contradictory information. We don't really even know how many cases there are. I have doctors in Spain telling me that they're not even testing people anymore. They're just marking them down as potential, oh, you're coughing, you've got it. There are a lot of questions that people are asking, and that's perfectly okay. Yes, there are people who are sick and dying, and that's horrible. But it's in our nature to ask questions, and that's perfectly acceptable. But the way that we ask questions and the way that we go about it can't be trying to blame something that isn't actually to blame. Now, having said all that, as I mentioned earlier, it is worth remembering that we do have 2G and 3G and 4G. We've had Wi-Fi for ages. As I mentioned in a previous video, there are lots of studies that show that wireless stuff is bad for you. I mentioned also in a previous video that children who are about 10 years old, they're the first generation that's been exposed to Wi-Fi pretty much their whole lives, possibly as much as 24 hours a day. What effect is that going to have on them? What effect is it going to have on their bodies and on their health? We don't actually know yet. And the reason we don't know is because they haven't even reached the age of maturity. Are they going to have more incidences of certain diseases by the time they're 20 or 30 years old? We have no idea. There are studies that show that yes, they probably will. We don't know. We have to wait and see. But just because 5G does not seem to cause coronavirus doesn't mean that we shouldn't actually fight to get rid of 5G and to minimize, for example, our children's exposure to wireless signals. Also, there are other things that are compromising our health. If you're eating McDonald's every day, if you live in a big city and you're inhaling, pollution, car exhaust and stuff, all the time. There's polluted water, there's polluted this, polluted that, there's plastics, there's bisphenol A, blah, 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 all these crazy, you start reading and you'll go mad reading about all the stuff that's toxic for you and blah, blah, blah. So it's not just only the wireless stuff that's bad. And this is, again, kind of something that, when you discover that wireless is maybe not good for you and you read some of these studies, we have a tendency to sort of go overboard and start blaming it for everything. And it could be a combination of your exposure to wireless and something in your diet, and a genetic predisposition to something, and pollution. There are many, many variables, and you have to consider all those variables. So, in the end, time will tell what's actually going on with this virus, but I don't really think that we can say that COVID-19 is actually, the symptoms are just, it's all caused by 5G, because that simply doesn't make sense. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and stop 5G, especially as the frequencies get higher into the millimeter band. Yes, based on the studies I have read, I don't think it's a very good idea, and if I have the opportunity to, I will fight against it. But sometimes a virus is just a virus, and 5G is just 5G, and we should all strive to stay as mentally and physically healthy as possible and fight them both. So that's about it. For more techie tips, see ScottiesTech.Info. Thanks for watching. See you next time.